So today we are going to be finishing up on the Vietnam War, go through all of that, and then we're going to have one lesson left in this unit. One thing that's going to be different today than we normally do, I do not have. This is basically lesson 6. We're continuing on lesson 6. So if you've been following along in the textbook, that's what this is. Again, you don't have to chat here if you don't want. I'm not taking attendance, but I do appreciate seeing some of that, just so I have an idea of who's all here. Just making sure everything's working. If something's not, I'm depending on you guys to let me know what's wrong, and if like audio cuts out or I sound weird or whatever, just make sure you're letting me know so I can fix that. Anyway, there will not be homework today. I'm sure you're all very excited about that. No homework today in terms of history. Obviously, I'm not speaking for everything else. What there will be, unfortunately, for there on Wednesday, I'm going to be pushing out what is going to be more or less an assessment for this unit. It's not going to be graded like a test, but it will be structured similar. There will be multiple choice. There will be short answer. It'll be a little shorter than what we normally would do for a test, but I'm going to be taking some of that and turning it into a Google form that will be for you guys to do. Now, it will be open notes. That's totally fine, but I want you to try and treat it a little bit kind of like it's a test or a quiz. I'm not going to be super strict about this. I can't obviously, go to your house and make sure you're doing everything the way I need to, but it will be something that it's going to be kind of like a wrap up for this unit to make sure you are really understanding everything we've talked about, everything we've gone through. So just get ready for that. It's again open note, so it's not going to be like the same kind of strict setup that we normally do, but that is going to be coming your way this Wednesday. And again, no homework for you today. So if you don't see anything come up on there, that's why. But this stuff is still important. It's important you get these notes down. I may, throw in something here that will be very important on the test. We'll see. So that just because there's no homework for today doesn't mean this information is just going away. It will be on our test. All right. Marxism, Leninism, communism. What do you mean? What? I'm a little confused by that. So if you have a question, phrase it a little different. Sorry. All right. So Vietnam. Obviously, we are dealing with history now that is really not that old, and that shapes the way our society looks very, very directly, even to today. So, first of all, I have this map here just so you understand where Vietnam is in scale of the world. Just south of China here, skinny little country alongside the South China Sea, and this is where a lot of this action is going to be taking place today. We're going to take a look at why we got involved and what happened when we were fighting in Vietnam, and some of the lasting effects, how society reacted, and how that's changed our attitude towards war ever since. Again, a lot of people commenting here. That's awesome. I'm glad to see you guys this morning. Getting used to waking up at 10:30, I guess. I know some people were complaining about that. I know it's a little earlier than what you might be used to, but I do appreciate you guys showing up here live. All right, moving on. All right, so setting the stage a little bit. A bit of background here for Vietnam and exactly why this ended up becoming such a hotbed for this war, this conflict, why it started here. So, as I said, narrow country in Southeast Asia, stretching along the South China Sea. And since the late 1800s, France had actually ruled Vietnam as a colony. So it was a target for Japan during World War II as one of those territories that they were trying to get from the European powers that they were going against. But France then retains control until 1954, where they were driven out by Ho Chi Minh and his forces. What lesson is this? This is continuation of 6. We kind of skipped 5, kind of integrated into the other two ones. This is basically the second half of lesson 6. Still all a part of what we called Kennedy, Johnson, and Vietnam. So, yeah, that's this lesson still. The Communist Party in Vietnam that caused the country to split, like half the country was capitalist, the other half was communist. Will we talk about that? Yes, absolutely. Actually, I mean, if you see right there that the notes that you're taking is exactly what it's talking about. So Ho Chi Minh. France obviously had influence across the globe, and when Vietnam tried to push for its independence, they were able to drive France out using a lot of the same tactics that we're going to see them use against the United States. So international peace conference is held to decide, all right, so how is Vietnam going to proceed forward? Are they going to be communist, capitalist? What is it going to look like there? So they ended up splitting the country in half, much like they did with Korea. Ho Chi Minh led communist North Vietnam, while Ngo Dinh Diem was the leader of the non-communist South Vietnam. And the USSR backed North Vietnam, US backed South Vietnam, as what would be expected. So staying kind of similar to Korea in that North was controlled by communists, South was controlled by capitalists or backed by the United States. There's Ho Chi Minh up there. Ends up being a very, very iconic figure in Vietnamese history, and we're going to see how he kind of extends his influence over the country. So, Diem in the South, and the United States backed the capitalist part of Vietnam, was not a very popular leader. In the eyes of many, especially can I go back? Of course I will. Yeah, sorry, I'm going a little too, you're right, I'm going a little too fast there. My bad, I'll wait here for just a second. Yep, I went back. I'll wait for the go-ahead from you guys, that's fine. Yeah. How was your weekend? Anybody do anything fun? Mine was pretty boring. Just played some video games with friends, which I really enjoy, but See. Got it all. Thank you. I'll wait for the go-ahead from a few other people. Drew with chalk outside. It's a Rise of Skywalker. Nice. I've seen a lot of great chalk drawings out there. Facebook, and nobody draws in chalk in my place. It's a little sad. Of course, I don't either, so I suppose I'm part of the problem. Awesome. Okay. Are we all good? Anybody stop me if we're not? Play the new Animal Crossing. Nice. Awesome. All right, we're continuing. So, as I always talk about, sorry for going so fast. Diem lost popular sport in South Vietnam with many of the populace, especially those in the lower class. They really did not like some of the policies he put into place. It felt like, to them, he was favoring the wealthy and was way too harsh on the general populace, like implementing laws that were not beneficial to the general public, and the standard of life for many would continue to decrease. So they looked for ways to rebel against him, and the way that they did that was forming what's known as the Vietcong. So they were guerrilla fighters who opposed South Korea, opposed the United States, opposed the way that they governed, and would launch weird, almost, it feels like non-formal attacks on the enemy. So basically, it's hit and run tactics. They would hide. They would attack strategic locations that were very, very difficult to plan against, and disappear just as quickly as they appeared. They didn't wear uniforms. They don't fight in large battles. So it was very, very tough to determine who was really a part of this guerrilla force. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit. But they would just appear seemingly out of nowhere, out of the jungle, out of the forest, out of wherever, and attack quickly, destroy whatever they were trying to attack, kill the soldiers that they were against, and disappear as soon as they had disappeared. So the Vietcong end up being supported by Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam, as they were basically trying to unite Vietnam underneath communist rule. And of course, the United States doesn't like that. And yeah, that guerrilla right here, that's how you pronounce that word there. So the Viet Cong are going to this guerrilla force that both the South Vietnamese forces and later the United States are going to be facing throughout this time. Let me know if I need to go back. But going forward. So Viet Cong successes, they worried America because they saw, you know what, Vietnam is going to lose here. So Diem does not have nearly enough support, and Vietnam's going to fall to communism. And when that happens, what is that going to do for the rest of the world? So in their mind, they thought that if South Vietnam fell to communism and they weren't able to extend their influence, it was going to lead to other countries falling under the same type of rule. And you can see countries like Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, Bangladesh, all these countries that are surrounding Vietnam in the what is known as Southeast Asia, they were worried that they were going to fall under the similar type of rule. And it's partially why they get involved. They're trying to make sure that this doesn't happen and that the world doesn't continue to fall this way. So I'm going to go back to this map. Countries we're talking about here are all surrounding Vietnam. Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, or Myanmar as it's known today, India, Bangladesh. They were worried about all these countries in this area falling to communism as well. And it falls to some sort of logical reason that would be the case. As China and Russia are continuing to actively spread their influence, the United States is worried about that continuing to spread throughout the rest of the world and becoming an issue economically, politically for the United States later on. So they wanted to get involved. They wanted to get involved right away. So what Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy do, they end up sending just military advisors to help train the South Vietnamese army, not really directly supporting in terms of sending thousands of troops over quite yet, but just helping them with tactical support and helping them become better soldiers, hopefully, to repel the Viet Cong and to maintain their control over South Vietnam. But of course, in 1963, Diem was assassinated, again, massively unpopular, just a few weeks before Kennedy was assassinated, actually, continuing to spread that instability, of course, in South Vietnam. And the Viet Cong are continuing to make progress, but they have not quite given up yet. So President Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson, comes in, takes the presidency after Kennedy and continues sending support to South Vietnam, but it's not enough. The Viet Cong continue to make gains, and it looks like it's going to be inevitable that South Vietnam is going to fall to these forces and be united underneath Ho Chi Minh, something that the United States is obviously scared about, concerned about, and trying to do everything that they can to stop. So they continue sending more support. They now have some ships that they send to patrol in the waters surrounding Vietnam to make sure that nothing is happening from let's say, the USSR sending support to Vietnam like they did to Cuba. And what ends up happening is that Johnson announces that a Vietnamese torpedo boat had attacked an American ship in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is this area just next to the northern part of Vietnam. So he doesn't ask to declare war directly, but instead they passed this Gulf of Tonkin resolution, allowing for the president to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack or prevent further aggression. It's more or less just saying the United States can now send troops to Vietnam to help, support South Vietnam. They're not to directly invade North Vietnam, but they want to help repel attack and prevent further aggression, more or less just saying we're getting involved now with our military, more or less declaring war. They've become now active fighters instead of simply sitting back and letting the Vietnamese conflict play out as it is with minimal intervention. Now they are directly involved. They are sending troops over and getting and fighting in this war. And by 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson had sent more than 500,000 troops to fight in Vietnam. So clearly a strong American presence there, trying to help fight. But this was an incredibly unique scenario that they were facing here in Vietnam. They were facing a method of fighting which they had never seen before. This is vastly different to the naval conflict that they had just fought in World War II. It's very, very different to the European side, where there's massive amounts of just tanks and armies clearly, displayed and marching towards a certain destination. This was this guerrilla type of warfare, where it was very, very difficult to tell who you were fighting, what they were trying to accomplish. And basically, they didn't even know how they were supposed to win this war. There was no clear objective. Like, they didn't want to directly invade North Vietnam. That could lead to more conflict with the USSR. That could lead to direct issues there. But just sitting in South Vietnam is not exactly the most helpful either. It's not quite sure what they are going to be able to do to help win this war. So let's take a look at this map, and we can see a little bit what ends up happening as North Vietnam continues to send in support down to South Vietnam. You can see a few different battles here. You have the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which we just talked about, which helped spark everything, and a few other battles here. You can see up here's Hanoi in North Vietnam, and down in South Vietnam, what was serving as the capital was Saigon, which in 1976 you can see is renamed to Ho Chi Minh City after the ruler of North Vietnam during this time. Can I go back a slide? Of course I can. And we can see that that's going to continue over the next few years. We think back to World War II and how many major battles we talked about. I think about that timeline and how many different things we could put on there. These were definitive battles, definitive events that for the most part had a clear victor, and you could directly see how that influences the next few steps in the war. In Vietnam, it's not quite that simple. You'd have an attack against or by the United States against what they thought was like a Vietcong stronghold, and they would clear it out and find very, very little evidence that people were there in the first place. And they would leave, and they would do what they could to make it unusable. But shortly after, all of a sudden, you got more soldiers back in that exact location, and it's kind of this weird back and forth where they tried to destroy as much as they could, and it was tough to gain any sort of actual measurable progress in this war. Ben, let me know when you're good. So it's not an easy situation for them. And as you can imagine, back home in the United States, there are many people who are getting tired of sending over soldiers to what feels like a big stalemate that's not making a ton of progress. So as we talked about, we can see how it was divided and continues up down here. So the Tet Offensive. So as I talked about, guerrilla warfare, very tough on American soldiers. They're not fighting in lands in which they're familiar, and you have these Vietcong soldiers who are extremely familiar with this land. That's their home, and they know how to get from place to place very easily, and are able to use that to their advantage. Americans had no enemy ground to gain. Instead, they had to destroy enemy positions. You would destroy a stronghold, guerrillas would disappear into the jungle until the Americans left, retake it, and it would be this back and forth struggle. So what they end up trying to do is cause a lot more of this mass destruction. You've probably heard of some of these chemical weapons that they started using. Namely, the big two were napalm and what's called Agent Orange. So they would cause massive amounts of destruction over these areas in an attempt to destroy what could be used as a stronghold. And what about the Vietcong rat tunnels? I was about to get to that. So you would have a lot of underground tunnels as well that would go from place to place that were very, very difficult to locate for the United States. They didn't know what to look for. They couldn't find them very easily. It allowed a lot of these Vietcong soldiers to come and go extremely quickly and made it very, very difficult for the United States to deal with that, to figure out how to fight fight in this way. So they used this chemical warfare to try and just destroy as much of this land as they could to render it unusable, because they didn't know how it was happening necessarily in many different locations. So it had obviously some effect there, but it also left a very, very negative image on the United States. And one thing that's important to realize about the Vietnam War, it was the first real war that was actively televised and publicized massively across the United States. They would see for the first time images and videos from this war, sometimes horrific images of people on fire and of their own soldiers wounded and maimed and all of this type of terrible stuff, and it looked really, really horrible to the American public. And they started to think, okay, why are we fighting in this in the first place? We'll talk more about that in the next slide, but that started to come in and be a part of the American culture. So, as I was talking about, tough to know who you're fighting. This quote from an American soldier: "The farmer you wave to from your Jeep in the day will be the guy with the gun out looking for you at night." They didn't know who they were fighting. It's not like in the previous wars where you have soldiers, they are uniformed, they are under direct command, and it's easy to know, okay, well, that's somebody you have to attack. That's somebody who you're up against. This time, they had no idea. They couldn't. It's hard to tell between civilians and these guerrilla fighters, because that was kind of the point. They were trying to make sure that they were trying to make it difficult for America to know exactly who they were fighting, what they were trying to do, and cause this demoralization. And they were very successful in doing so. In January 1968, Vietcong launched a surprise attacks throughout Vietnam in what's known as the Tet Offensive. So Tet is basically the more or less the Independence Day for Vietnam at the time. So it was a pretty big shock to many across South Vietnam that they would use this day as a day to attack. But that's what they did, and they were very, very successful in doing so, causing a lot of casualties, especially in for South Vietnam soldiers. And it shows to the American public, to the American soldiers, that they are no closer to a victory than they were when the war started. So they've been involved now for a few years, and they had made no progress. They had lost some, but they weren't like about to be driven out. They still had obviously a strong number. America wasn't going to, lose in terms of just amount of soldiers, but they weren't really making any progress. They weren't any closer to winning. So why are they continuing to fight this ongoing, seemingly endless war with no clear goal in sight? So Americans back home begin to get upset. They begin to protest. They begin to find ways to push back against this war. All right, let's take a look at some of the numbers from here. So first of all, how war deaths. So United States military, 58,000. Obviously a huge number in terms of just American soldiers losing their lives for the sake of this war. And we know that those that they are honored with the Vietnam War Memorial that is in Washington D.C. The wall with everybody's name on that. So that's a very impactful thing to go and see. And then, of course, North Vietnam, Vietcong, about a little over 1 million. South Vietnamese Army, 250,000. And then, of course, civilians through just the process of war running over much of this location, about 2 million. So clearly, very costly. Not as costly as previous wars, especially for the United States, from the United States perspective. But still, that's a huge amount of people for what ends up being a unsuccessful campaign. By the numbers, you had helicopters now being used as part of wars, about 12,000. Tons of bombs dropped by U.S. planes, 8 million. And, of course, the average soldier there is 22, which, that's even younger than I am. So it's kind of putting that in perspective. Average number of days you would see of combat, you would see 240. So that was particularly unusual. You never knew exactly when you would be fighting. And that's part of the nature of this guerrilla warfare is you would have all of these surprise attacks come upon you just seemingly out of nowhere. End up having about 3 million personnel deployed, or 3.5 million almost. And then, of course, the cost here. And this is another big cause of these protests. Another big issue back home is that it costs billions and billions of dollars. And you can see just the general progression of troops up till 1968, where you have a little over 500,000 troops deployed in Vietnam, and then eventually after this Tet Offensive, as we talked about, this realization that it's not happening, and you can see that those numbers decrease until 1973. There's very, very few men still deployed there. All right, so back at home, casualties begin to climb, monies continue to be spent, and no progress is being made. Public support for the war continues to fade. You watch these images of war on the television, you had these reporters coming back and talking about the horrors and how horrible it was over there and how they're, and how everything is terrible in Vietnam, and there's no reason for the United States to be involved, and that obviously hurts public support. And again, you had more and more Americans asking the question, why are we continuing to spend money and lives fighting for this small country overseas that many people probably hadn't even heard of just a few years prior? So the U.S. continues to try and set a foothold here and help out South Vietnam. Hopefully they could find a peace soon enough. They expand the draft, but they do so unequally. In the eyes of many, they don't feel like the draft is fair for everybody. You had young, upper class, middle class. That's supposed to be men. Just a second. Let me edit that so I don't have to worry about it again. Men were able to avoid the draft by doing things like attending college, having kids. I know that there were many people who would sometimes would do that intentionally. Sometimes it would just be the way that things would go. They would have different exemptions for people who were married, who had kids, who were doing all of these different things, and they would not be drafted to go and fight overseas. And many people didn't feel like that was fair. especially those who were in the lower class. They felt like they were being drafted at far higher rates than those who were in the upper middle class. And what that ends up doing is just continuing to spread this growing discontent for war. So that continues to grow and grow, and these protests continue to show up seemingly more and more across the nation, and particularly in college campuses were a big hotbed for protests and anti-war activity. You would see a lot of action there, and even to today, as you probably know, college campuses are a pretty common place to see different groups of students, different groups trying to spark a movement and make a national impression for whatever they are, working for or against. And perhaps the most famous incident throughout this took place at Kent State. So at Kent State, they were in 1970. They were continuing to protest some of the actions of that the United States military was doing, particularly, I believe, in this time in Cambodia, which was right next to Vietnam, so all part of this conflict. There were some protests being held there when, seemingly out of nowhere, the Ohio State Guard shows up, and as they're trying to contain things, shots are fired, and 4 students are killed. And there were investigations into what happened. It turns out tens of different, almost, I think it was 60 shots were fired by the military, but nothing was shot back. The distance was huge between the two groups, and it ends up being a massive black eye for the United States. Of course, people continue to protest. Students strike as they are after this incident, and demand justice. And to this day, there still remains a lot of memorials and remembrance for those students, especially at that university. But just kind of shows it's a big example of how the growing discontent at home had spread to much of the country, and how that ended up turning into violence even back at home. And you had these two separate groups. You had the Hawks and you had the Doves. So as you can probably gather by those names, Doves were those who were advocating for peace, who were against the war, would do what they could to get out of it. Some people even burned their draft cards in an attempt to get out of service, an attempt to show that they were not going to be participating in this war that they disagreed with. Hawks were those who supported the military action there and supported this fight basically against communism, and were more actively participating in those ways. What this ends up doing is that it has a lasting impression on the United States today and how we view war. Everybody before this and World War II, for the most part, the majority of Americans would support the United States in their military actions. Vietnam, for the first time, you had, perhaps even the majority of the Americans really questioning whether or not the war was worth it. And to this day, when we fight in wars in the Middle East, you have huge parts of the population really questioning, is this worth spending the money? Is this worth spending our troops to fight for these causes that are not as directly associated with the United States? This anti-war movement is far more accepted now today than perhaps it used to be before Vietnam. Obviously, it affects culture as well. We just took a look, before I started my lesson today, I played "Fortunate Son" by Creedence Clearwater Revival. Great song. I think most people like that song. It's really great, but it's also a commentary on Vietnam and America at the time. You may be asked to analyze it when you're in high school. I know I did, so I won't go into it too much. But it's one of the ways that this movement has influenced culture back then and kind of still even to today. So you have what is known as the Counterculture Movement. So the anti-war protests, they fed the spirit of rebellion among young people and begin to reject these traditional American values. We've talked about this now pretty much for every decade we've really analyzed culture. There's always going to be this movement of people who are kind of go against the mainstream. They reject, in this case, rejecting materialism, rejecting nationalism, rejecting just supporting America, without thought about it, like anti-military, all this kind of stuff. They criticize competition, this drive for personal success, materialism. Of course, you have what we call today, hippies who are joining communes, experimenting with illegal drugs, going against the mainstream in an attempt to, be rebellious and show their discontent for what had come before. Their parents, grandparents, and what values they held, they wanted to show that they did not feel the same way. They did not hold the same values. They called for peace, justice, social equality, things that, of course, everybody supports, but they really went out and wanted to make that statement through their actions, through their looks, through what they, what they did. They wore torn, faded jeans and work shirts. Men grew long hair and beards. Again, less like their parents and more like their own individual culture. And this kind of continues to grow almost to the point where it becomes somewhat mainstream. There's a poster there for Woodstock, becoming part of the face of this counterculture movement, this idea that why do we care about, stuff? Why can't we care about, people and music and freedom and things like that? And of course, that's still part of much of what mainstream America holds important to this day is ideas like that. We, taking that time to relax and not worry about making the most money constantly, and perhaps having, enjoying what we have here now today. Certainly, as at least part of what we hold important today in 2020. All right, so I think that's going to do it for me today. I know I said it was going to be a little shorter, maybe not. But if you have any other questions for me, if you want me to go back to anything, let me know in the chat right now. I'm going to wrap up for YouTube. All right, thank you guys for watching this on YouTube, if that's where you are. Just a reminder, we do not have homework today on Monday. There will be a much longer, probably about 20 questions or so, assessment this Wednesday that will be pushed out to you guys. Make sure you keep an eye out for that. Using your notes, make sure you're collecting all of those. If you don't have those written down, you need to get those down so you could go through my old videos and skip through very quickly. Make sure you have those down either on a Google Doc or separate sheet of paper so you can use those for your assessment. Otherwise, it's going to be not very easy, and I'm sure you don't want to have to do the same assessment 5 different times before you get it completely 100% done. So let me know if you have any questions. And if you're watching this on YouTube, see you at 1:30. Bye.